Welcome. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO of Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore, welcome. How are you today?
My pleasure. Great. I'm fine. Thank you.
So good to have you here. So we have an amazing conversation ahead of us. I'm really excited to dive into this and to bring everybody a little bit of context. We're going to be discussing the future of East versus West. And this is such an important topic at many levels. And we can be sure of one thing, is that how US-China relations and how Eastern and Western relations evolve over time will have a defining role, not just on the remainder of the 21st century, but perhaps for the future of humanity at large. So we're here today to learn about this topic and also figure out how we can each play a role for creating a bright, prosperous future together. Our guide today, Kishore, is truly the ultimate guide on this topic. He is renowned as the Muse of the Asian century. He's an international renowned diplomat and writer. He is Singapore's former permanent representative to the United Nations, and he served as the president of the UN Security Council 2 times. He's the former dean of National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He is also currently a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute. He recently published Has China Won? ? And according to Lawrence Summers, the former president of Harvard University, there is no better guide for Westerners to the Asian worldview than Kishore. So we're very lucky to have him here. And our conversation is going to have 3 specific sections. First, we're going to really learn from him about what's at stake and key developments, East versus West. And then we're going to learn about key action items we can take individually, organizationally, and nationally. And then finally, the best part is going to be an audience Q&A with everybody participating live. So I challenge all of us to come up with great questions for Kishore. And I'm going to kick it off with a few questions of my own. So Kishore, before I kick off, I want to quote from one of your recent articles. You said, and I quote, "The big lesson I learned from Singapore's exceptional geopolitical masters was that the first step to formulate any long-term strategy is to frame the right questions. If one gets the question wrong, the answers will be wrong. Most importantly, in formulating such questions, one must always, quote unquote, think the unthinkable." So with that in mind, both our audience and I will do the best to ask you the right questions. And my first question is, why do East versus West relations matter to everyone globally? And what are those potentially unthinkable outcomes at stake that all of us should be thinking about?
Thank you, Barry. I'm really happy to join you all, even though it's 11 p.m. in Singapore, but I feel wide awake on your show. I tell you, my answer to your question first is that it's important for us to understand that the biggest fact of our time is that we are entering a new era of human history. And it's characterized by the fact that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800, out of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies in the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. So if you view the past 200 years of world history against the backdrop of the last 2,000 years of world history, the past 200 years of world history have been a major historical aberration. Now, all aberrations come to a natural end. So that's why you're naturally seeing the return of Asia, the return of China, and the return of India. And when you ask what would be the unthinkable option, I can tell you that what is absolutely unthinkable to any American politician, and he won't even dare to think about it, less to say it, which is that the United States, for the first time in over 100 years, is going to become the #2 economy in the world sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's unthinkable. You cannot talk about it, but it's a reality that's coming. And I would say prepare for the world that is coming, not the world that you want to fantasize about.
Thank you, Kishore. And share with us, like, what's at stake here? Like getting this right, navigating East-West relations right versus not doing so. What does the world have to gain or lose depending on how we navigate?
Well, I think we live at a moment of history where we are at a fork in the road, you know. So if you take the right turn, right meaning, you know, in every sense, right rather than wrong, rather than right and left. If you take the right turn, then we can actually, all of humanity come together to create a much better world. And at a time when the world is facing major global challenges like global warming, and especially now COVID-19, it will make a sense for the whole world to come together to deal with these common challenges. And that's why East and West and China and America need to work together. That's why it's so important. But of course, if you see, if you know, as in my book, Has China Won? Sadly, I predict, and I hope I'm wrong, but I predict that in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see a major geopolitical contest between US and China, driven by deep structural forces, historical structural forces like the world's #1 power always pushes down the world's #2 power, plus China conjures up images of the yellow peril, plus China's not becoming a democracy. So in the case of United States, as we all know, a huge head of steam is building up towards a confrontation with China. And I fear that's going to happen. So the purpose of my book is to avoid that confrontation and say, let's come together to deal with the real common challenges that we face, which are things like global warming and especially COVID-19.
Excellent. So your message ultimately is one of unity and working together, although you do predict some major turbulence along the way. When you look at this from a historical perspective and in terms of you know, like both over history and recent times, what would you say are the key drivers and trends around the relations between East and West? So what are the main levers that are influencing or having the biggest influence?
Well, here too, there are two conflicting forces at play. On the one side, the reason why the East is coming back, the reason why Asian societies are doing so well is because they have learned so much from the West, you know. So in a previous book called The New Asian Hemisphere, I say that the Asians have succeeded because they finally understood, absorbed, and implementing 7 pillars of Western wisdom, you know, like free market economics, mastery of science and technology. And frankly, if the West had not succeeded first, the East would not have succeeded. So we in the East should send the West a big thank you note saying, thank you very much for being the world's first civilization to succeed as well as you did. But having succeeded now, then you've got to rebalance the relationship, and you now need a two-way street of learning. And I give you a simple example. Ask yourself, why is it that when COVID-19 broke out, and everyone thought it would be the Western societies that would handle it better, but surprisingly, the Eastern societies are handling it COVID-19 better, because if you look at the death rate per million, in most East Asian countries is less than 10 per million. Whereas if you look at Europe and United States, it's 100, 700, 800 a million compared to less than 10 a million. So why are East Asian societies, which used to be students of the Western societies, doing better now? And the fact that they're doing better now shows that the Eastern societies have learned so much from the West. And that's why you need, instead of having a one-way street of learning from the East learning from the West, you need both sides to learn from each other. And that's where we should be today.
Thank you so much, Kishore. So two forces. On the one hand, the East has learned a lot from the West. On the other hand, the rebalancing is necessary from your perspective. Now I want to zoom in a little bit to the two key actors here, China and the US, and then we can zoom back out to East and West in a global perspective. Share with us, in your view, how does China think and see itself in the world, and what are its key goals? And share with us, if you would, how that compares to how the US sees itself, how it thinks in the world, and where you see the key points of friction between these two.
You know, it's important to remember a very famous saying by Napoleon, where he said, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. And guess what? Napoleon was right. China was sleeping. And as you know, the West woke up China by trampling all over China in the 19th century. And that's why the Chinese suffered what they call a century of humiliation. Now, fortunately for us, after the century of humiliation, after Kissinger and Nixon went to China in 1971, 50 years ago, 1971, 72, China has woken up happily. And frankly, it's in the interest of China, of the world, for China to wake up happily. And if China wakes up happily, China will be happy to cooperate with the rest of the world and cooperate with the United States of America. So we have a paradox today where when it is in the interest of the West not to make China angry, the West is now actually making China very angry in the way it is treating China. So to answer your question very simply, the Chinese have no desire to run the world. The Chinese leaders have only one mission. China, at the end of the day, represents the world's most successful civilization because it's the world's oldest continual civilization of the 4,000-year history. It's been knocked down 4 times and it has woken up 4 times. And all the Chinese want to do is wake up and strengthen Chinese civilization. You can have a strong Chinese civilization and you can have a strong America, a strong Europe, and that's not a contradiction. But in the case of the United States has become so used to being number 1 in the world for over 100 years. The United States cannot accept the fact they can ever become number 2. Even becoming number 2 to a society that is got 4 times the population and 4,000 years of history instead of 250 years of United States. So there's a deep psychological reluctance on the part of United States, accept the fact that there's a different world that is coming. But as I emphasize in my book, China and America can live together in peace and actually work together to improve the well-being of their people, so that in the case of the United States, it's the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. By contrast, the past 40 years have been the best 40 years for the Chinese people in 4,000 years of Chinese history. So it's amazing, but while China is going up, the United States has been going down, but they both actually, despite this, can work together. And I hope that at the end of the day, China and America will come together to improve the well-being of their people, and they can best do this if they stop this unnecessary geopolitical contest.
Thank you, Kishore. Just want to dive a tiny bit deeper into this one thing you said with such conviction. You said China has absolutely no desire to, take over the world, let's say. You didn't say it that way, but like, it doesn't have this. What makes you so certain of that? I'm not questioning it. I'm just curious, like, what gives you that confidence? Because many people might feel otherwise. Maybe it's because they don't understand China, but would love to understand from you why you say that with such confidence.
Well, there's 2,000 years of Chinese history to back up my claim. By the way, before the Portuguese exploded around the world and conquered territories around the world, as you know, the Portuguese were amazing. They colonized Brazil in South America. They colonized Angola, Mozambique in Africa. They took a bite of India and Goa. They took a bite of China and Macau. They're amazing, right? Before that, the world's largest navy was actually Chinese. And there was Admiral Cheng Ho that in the 15th century went around the world, went to Africa, went to India, but didn't conquer any territories at all. They could have done so 500 years ago. And if you look at the map of Asia, the biggest piece of unoccupied territory is Australia. Now, frankly, the Chinese were expansionists. They should have taken over Australia 500 years ago, but it was the British that came all the way across from the other side of the world to take over Australia. So, there's 2,000 years of history that shows that the Chinese have no global expansionist plans. And besides, the Chinese basically realize that China is a big enough project to get right, and they just want to revitalize Chinese civilization. They respect other countries that want to do well, and they'll be happy to work with them. but they have no, and you see, the Americans believe that anybody can become an American. And Barry, as you know, you came from a different country and you're now fully American. But if you went to China and you tried to be Chinese, they say, excuse me, you're not Chinese. So they don't have this universalizing dream. They would love to work with you, but they say, we will not try to make you Chinese because only Chinese are Chinese, and they don't try to convert the world. So it's a very different approach to the world from the American vision.
Thank you, Kishore. That's a great segue to my next question. So let's take a moment to really reflect on the key strengths and weaknesses on both sides of this equation. So you already started sharing some of them, but in your view, share with us, like, what is a particular source of strength for Chinese society and civilization, right? Above and beyond its population and economic growth. What else is there? And then what might be Achilles heel type factors potentially for Chinese society? And then share with us the same for the United States. And I think that will give us a good grounding on, what we can, how we can basically have both of those countries in the right perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think the great Chinese strength is their deep cultural confidence in their civilization. I mean, the Chinese look back at the well of history they come from. It was supposed to be 4,000 years. Now they discover it's 5,000 years. Can you imagine a 5,000-year well of history that you're living on? And so that gives them a tremendous sense of cultural confidence. And whenever they go down, they always come back up. They have a remarkable civilizational resilience. And when Mao Zedong said in 1949, when the People's Republic of China was created, he said China has stood up again. And this is the remarkable thing about China, it's its resilience as a civilization. And if you wanted me to point to the Achilles heel of China, I would say the Achilles heel of China is their political system. Because at the end of the day, right now, China is very lucky. It has a very strong, dynamic leader, President Xi Jinping. But how do you ensure you get another strong, dynamic leader? So that I think that is a big challenge when you have a communist party system. That's their Achilles heel. In the case of United States, of course, United States' great strength is that it is able to attract the best brains from all over the world, including Barry, to come and live and work in the United States. I mean, it's amazing. And in my book, I have a fictional memo to Xi Jinping talking about the great contest between US and China. And in this fictional memo, a colleague of President Xi, Comrade Xi, says, Comrade Xi, we're taking on the United States. Of course, we will win, but we must never underestimate the United States, because while China can harvest the best brains from 1.4 billion people, the United States can harvest the best brains from 7.8 billion people. And if you look at two of America's largest corporations, Google and Microsoft, they're run by Indian-born immigrants, and that shows you how remarkable the United States. That is its great strength. But it's Achilles heel today, which actually I speak about in my book, is reliance on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And by weaponizing the US dollar, the United States is creating an incentive from the rest of the world to walk away from the US dollar as a global reserve currency. And if they do so, then there'll be actually a significant reduction in the living standards of Americans, because they can no longer print money to buy goods from the rest of the world.
Thank you. So China, the strength of a resilient civilization with a political system that might prove to be an Achilles heel. And in the US, it's this attractiveness to talent around the world, but just dependence on the US dollar being a reserve currency, which you think might actually not be something that it can draw on in the future. Share with us your view towards everybody who says, hey, you know what? The US has been underestimated time and again. In the 80s, it was Japan that was supposed to be taking over. Before, in the middle of the Cold War, it was thought that, well, centrally planned Russian kind of approach to things is going to do better. what makes you feel like this is just different this time, that truly the US might actually become number two, when it didn't become so in previous times when another country challenged its preeminence?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, that's exactly what my memo says, to my fictional memo to President Xi Jinping says: never, never underestimate the United States of America. Because since human history began, the United States has clearly become the most successful society in terms of uplifting its people. And only one country has sent men to the moon, and that's the United States of America. And the United States has achieved remarkable things. So it would be a huge mistake for China to underestimate the United States of America. But at the same time, the United States has enjoyed 100 years of triumph. You're right, it defeated Germany in World War I. It defeated Germany and Japan in World War II. It has also overcome the Japanese economic challenge. It defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So the United States has got used to winning. And the danger of getting used to winning is that you take victory for granted. You assume you're going to win, just like that, no matter what happens. But actually, if the United States takes on China, it's taking on a challenger of a different magnitude. It's got 4 times the population, you know. And you know, if the Chinese people, and I think you would agree with me that Chinese people are reasonably smart. If the Chinese people could achieve half the per capita income of the United States of America, half, China's economy will be twice the size of the United States. Now, the United States has never dealt, except before it became number one, when the British were number one, has never dealt with an economy bigger than the United States of America. But I'm reasonably confident that in my lifetime, I will see that the Chinese economy will become bigger. And just assuming the Chinese keep growing at 5 to 6% a year. And don't forget, you know, the many East Asian societies have shown the way for China already. So Japan, South Korea, Singapore have all been very successful. So what we have accomplished, China can also accomplish. Can you hear me? We lost
Kishore, for that. We have a storm here in New York City, so I apologize. I think we had a slight break. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
yes,
my apologies for that. Thank you for your response there. So I want to ask you, having shared everything you have so far, let's quickly talk about just 2 other powers, European Union on the one hand and India on the other. Please share with us your perspectives on how these 2 very significant blocs play into East-West relations.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad that you brought in the European Union and you brought in India, because the key point I'm going to make is that if there's one confident prediction I can make about the 21st century, is that, you know, we used to have a bipolar world in the Cold War, where you had 2 powers, United States and Soviet Union. And then in the post-Cold War era, we moved to a unipolar world with only one power, the United States of America. But now we're moving into a multipolar world with many powers. And I think that's good for the world. And the two other potential alternative poles are, of course, the European Union, whose economy is, you know, as big as the United States. And then you have also India, which has a population almost the same size as China. And as I mentioned to you, from the year 1 to the year 1820, the 2 largest economies were always those of China and India. China has come back first. India is going to come back also in due course. And you can tell how successful Indians can be, because if you look at the United States, which has the most competitive human laboratory in the world, with the best brains coming from all over the world to compete in the United States of America, the ethnic community with the highest per capita income is the Indian community. So the Indians can be very, very successful. So I think India coming back to, so we're going to move the multipolar world, and that's good for the world to have China, India, Europe, United States of America, and Japan, and some African countries will come back, and Russia. So it'll be a much more interesting world and a more stable world.
Excellent. Let's hope so. My last question before we dive into audience questions, Kishore, this has been excellent so far. So having everything you said in mind, how do we build better bridges between East and the West? What are the actions we can take at an individual level, organizationally, nationally, and internationally, to make sure that the next years of rebalancing are played out in the
well, I mean, the answer is very simple. You are in New York. I'm in Singapore. We are on opposite sides of the world, and we are talking to each other, and we understand each other, and we can communicate with each other. And that's all we need to do. At the end of the day, you need to encourage more face-to-face conversations like the one that you and I are having, Barry, and try to get, and for example, you know, one of the biggest mistakes that the Trump administration has made is, for example, to close the Chinese consulate in Houston. At a time when misunderstanding is growing, you should have more diplomacy, more face-to-face conversations rather than less face-to-face conversations. And at the end of the day, you know, China has no desire to either invade or occupy the United States of America. China has no desire to take over United States' global role as a kind of global policeman. So it is actually possible for a strong United States to live together with a strong China, but each side must understand each other, and that requires a lot of talking. And I think if I may make a slight criticism, you know, the United States is, of course, a great country, is the most, as I said, it's been the world's most successful country, but it has also become a mono-civilizational country. And it doesn't seem to be, it lives in a kind of a bubble of its own, a cultural bubble of its own. And it's important for Americans to travel overseas more to understand the rest of the world. So I say the first step maybe to take is give every American a passport and tell them once in your life, you must go to Asia to see what it's like.
Thank you for that call to action, Kishore. This was great. So we've got amazing questions, and let's do our best, maybe like 1-2 minute answers to these so we get through all of them. For everybody else dialing in live, if you have any questions, please try to submit them in the next couple minutes to make sure that we can get to them. So Kishore, there's like 3 or 4 questions all around, you know, Chinese-Indian relations and like questioning, you know, whether or not actually China, like, you know, is as non-aggressive as perhaps you were saying. So one question from Diraj Shah, he asks, how do you explain the Chinese aggression with India at the Galwan Valley or their expansion in Africa? It contradicts your view that the Chinese are not looking to grow their might globally.
Well, I mean, you know, like, you know, my book Has China Won? It's about today's world #1 power, which today is the United States, and the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China. This is because this is 2020. Now, if I was writing my book in 2050, the world's #1 power will be China, and the world's #1 emerging power will be India. So it will be a China-India contest, and United States, I suspect, might become #3 by then. So, so the contest will shift. And there's absolutely no question that there will be some kind of geopolitical rivalry between China and India. But again, the good news between China and India is that they've been neighbors for 2,000 years. And for most of the 2,000 years, they haven't fought each other, you know. And actually, in many ways, they've had a very strong, peaceful relationship with each other. So for example, one of the key religions of China is Buddhism. And where did Buddhism come from? It came from India. So they go back into the deep roots. And if there's one word that, if your audience could Google, the one word is Nalanda. Nalanda is the world's oldest university. It was thriving in the 9th century AD. And that was when Chinese scholars would travel this incredibly long, either land route or sea route, just to go to Nalanda in India to study. And I'm talking about something that happened 1200 years ago, right? So these are the ancient historical connections that can also come back. And so that's why it's a mistake to think that it'll all be about a war. But, you know, in response to the question about China's global ambitions, China wants to trade with everybody in the world. China has got global trading ambitions, but China has no desire to go out and replace the United States. And for example, as you know, in my book, I say that every time the United States fights a war in the Middle East, it's a gift to China, because the United States gets distracted while China grows. And so the Chinese learn a lesson from that and say, no, we're not going to go out and fight wars. And then the remarkable thing about China is that it's the only permanent member of the UN Security Council that has not fought a war in 40 years, since the war against Vietnam. And China actually hasn't fired a bullet in 30 years, since the skirmish against Vietnam. So that shows a great deal of strategic discipline. And you know, in my book, I describe a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger, who basically told me that the biggest mistake the United States has made is to launch a geopolitical contest with China without first working out a strategy. The Chinese always think long-term and think strategically, and don't try to go for short-term victories in places. So in that sense, they have a very different approach from the United States. So I'm sure China will become an assertive global power, but an assertive global power need not be an aggressive global power.
Excellent. Thank you, Kishore. Next one is from Andy Strangeman, who asks, will not the real conflict between the US and Western democracies and China be based on ideology rather than economics? Individual freedoms versus servant for the good of the state. How could such a chasm be bridged?
Well, that's a very good question. And indeed, it was ideology that divided the Soviet Union and the United States in the first Cold War, because the United States said capitalism is better and I want more countries to adopt it. And the Soviet Union said communism is better and we want more countries to adopt it. And the Soviet Union tried to support communist parties around the world and try to influence countries becoming communist. What's interesting is that China has stopped exporting communism. After Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore in 1978, and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the then Prime Minister of Singapore, said to him, how can I be your friend if you're going to try and export communism to Singapore? So they said, okay, Deng Xiaoping stopped, and all the support for the communist parties in Southeast Asia stopped. So the Chinese view is that what we have in China is good for us, but it need not necessarily be good for you. And so they're saying, okay, if the United States can remain a democratic, freedom-loving, capitalist country, and China has no desire to change the American system, and at the same time, I think the United States should decide, okay, if the Chinese want to have their system, let them have their system, because at the end of the day, it's up to the 1.4 billion people in China to choose the government that they want to have. And you know, most people in the United States think that the Chinese Communist Party is oppressing the Chinese people. But you know, the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center has just come out with a study in July this year, last month, pointing out the reason why the Chinese Communist Party is so resilient is because it enjoys a dramatic amount of support from the Chinese people. And that's something that very few Americans know. And this is a Harvard Kennedy School study.
Very quick follow-up to that, Kishore, from Andy. He asked, how do you anticipate China's government and leadership to evolve as its economy matures and its citizens become wealthier? Just in a nutshell.
Well, very quickly, I mean, as I mentioned, the political system of China is China's potential Achilles heel. And as China, by the way, may already have the world's largest middle class, by the way. Definitely will have the world's largest middle class in the next 10 to 15 years. And so managing a middle class population is very different from managing a country of 800 million peasants. And so that will be a big challenge for China.
Thank you, Kishore. We've got a number of questions here about TikTok. So Tapiwa Manjangwa is asking, what are your thoughts on the potential, if any, and the magnitude of Chinese retaliation to some of the activities that Trump has carried out as it relates to, for example, TikTok? There are large US companies that also depend on the ability to do business in the US. And Jeff Cordover also asks, tell us about your views on the matter with TikTok.
Well, I must confess that, you know, since I'm 71 years old, I've never seen a TikTok. But from what I can tell, it is the most frivolous thing in the world. And I never thought that something as frivolous as TikTok could be seen as a national security threat to the United States. I mean, we live in a very strange world if TikTok becomes a big threat. But, you know, it is at the end of the day, United States has the sovereign right to decide whether or not to allow TikTok to come to the United States. As you know, China doesn't allow Google or Facebook to operate in China. So it's up to the United States to decide. But it would be good for the United States to explain what is its strategy. What is it trying to accomplish? Because if you keep cutting off your ties with China, at the end of the day, how does it benefit the long-term American position? How does it affect the global transformation that is happening? Because, and you know, if you want to know what's really behind TikTok, the real issue here is that the United States does not want to become the #2 power in the world. That's the critical thing they're trying to do. And they believe that by cutting China off from access to technology or spread of Chinese technology, the United States can box China in. And that may happen, okay, it may happen, but I think it's very unlikely, because when the United States tries to deprive China of modern technology, it is like trying to shut the stable door after the horse has bolted. Chinese technology has taken off. There's no way you can push China back in the technological war. So I would say this is an example of the United States doing something impulsively without any clear strategy behind it.
Thank you, Kishore. Next one, there's two questions that are very related, so I'm going to read them both. First from Jyoti Balani, who says, with US 2020 elections upon us, how can US voters address this relative to the platforms our candidates represent? What's your view on which party will be best to push the East-West working together agenda? I honestly don't see a clear path in either party. Do we have any hope as US citizens to influence this? Hold that thought. A related question from Andras Forgax, who asks, how is the long-term trajectory of US-China policy a function of US domestic politics? In other words, how do the US political parties fundamentally differ in long-term China policy?
Well, both excellent questions, and I'm glad that Jyoti Balani recognized the Mohammad Rafi song that you played earlier. Now, on the candidates, if I was advising the government of China, I would say it doesn't matter whether Trump gets elected or Biden gets elected, because the US-China geopolitical contest, as I say in my book, is driven by deep structural forces. So personalities in that sense don't matter. I mean, Joe Biden will clearly be more courteous towards China. I mean, he won't insult the Chinese in the way that some members of the Trump administration have done so. But actually, Joe Biden will be a more formidable competitor for China, because, you know, President Trump's administration has alienated many American allies in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea. President Biden, if he becomes president, can bring together the old allies of the United States of America. And therefore, he might actually be a more formidable challenger for China than President Trump could be. But at the end of the day, the geopolitical contest, because it's driven by deep structural forces, will continue. So if you ask me what what should the American voters do? The American voters should also send a very clear signal that the key priority of any US government should be to improve the well-being of the American people, and therefore stop getting engaged in unnecessary geopolitical contests, which are draining the American budget, draining the American spirits. And you know, by the way, one of your best-known strategic thinkers, George Kennan, who advised the United States in the struggle against the Soviet Union, said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest with Soviet Union or China would depend on the spiritual vitality of American society. So the American people should say, let's focus on rebuilding our spiritual vitality. Let's avoid this unnecessary geopolitical contest. I mean, that's the message I would give. Now, just quickly remind me of your second question again.
Yeah, they were related. They were both actually asking about US domestic politics and its implications. So that was very well done. Thank you for both of the people who asked those questions. Kishore, there's a number of questions that I'm going to try to tie together. You've presented a positive vision in terms of like one of cooperation, collaboration, and getting along. At the same time, there are some uncomfortable things also that we haven't really like gone too deep on. So I'm going to try to tie these together. So Craig Neiman asks, how should the US respond to China with regards to their aggressive actions towards Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the islands in the South Sea? We have also a number of other people asking questions about how should the US respond to, the West respond to the human rights record of China? And, you know, like just generally how, while we try to collaborate and build the best way forward, how do we also respond to actions that we believe to be wrong? And when I say we, I'm talking about the people asking the questions from the United States and the West.
Well, I mean, those are very good questions. But to answer the question on Hong Kong and Taiwan, you have to first look at history and ask how Hong Kong and Taiwan used to be part of China. How did they become separated from China? And, you know, I mentioned the century of humiliation that China went through. And the way Hong Kong got separated from China is that the British came to China in the 1840s and said that we want to buy your Chinese tea. And the Chinese said, okay, no problem. Just give me your British silver. I'll give you Chinese tea. The British said, no, that's not fair. I want to give you opium. Please accept my opium in return for Chinese tea. And the Chinese said, no, opium is bad for us. Opium is banned in UK. You don't allow British people to smoke opium. Why are you forcing us to accept opium? So when the British rejected opium, when the Chinese rejected opium from the British thought this is very unreasonable. So they attacked China, bombarded China, and seized Hong Kong. Now, it's important to know that story because Hong Kong is a living symbol of the century of humiliation that China went through. So when China says Hong Kong should come back to China, it is saying what happened in 1842 was dead wrong. And history is on China's side. And similarly, how did Taiwan get separated from China? It's because the Japanese launched a war against China in 1895 when China was weak. And then when China lost the war, Japan separated Taiwan from China. So it's important to understand this long history that's there. And at the end of the day, I have a simple message on Hong Kong and for Taiwan is those of you who want to help the people of Hong Kong and those of you who want to help the people of Taiwan, don't get them to knock their heads against a wall. Get them, if you try and get the people of Hong Kong to go for independence, they're dead, you know. And remember, I tell you a story. In the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a complete Anglophile, and said, no, please don't invade Goa because it's a Portuguese territory. Within a few days of receiving the letter, Nehru just invaded Goa. Said, this is Indian territory, we take it back, right? So this is how great powers behave. The United States invaded Grenada, remember, in the 1980s? So when you're living next to a great power, like the United States, like India, like China, don't provoke it. So be very careful when you handle Hong Kong and Taiwan issues. Now, on the second question of human rights, you know, I addressed that very fully in my book, and I would encourage people to read what I say in my book. You know, no country is perfect on human rights. And certainly when it comes to dealing with the Muslim minorities, all countries have had challenges. And you know, in my book, one of the most sensitive things I say actually is that the Islamic world is going through a major struggle trying to modernize and enter the modern world. And so the world should work together with the Islamic world and cooperate with them and help them succeed. But as we know, lots of wars are being fought in the Islamic world. A lot of Muslims are being killed all over the place. And indeed, if there's one thing that, since the United States has had its 9/11 moment and been attacked, and since China, by the way, most Americans are not aware of this, also had a 9/11 moment where Chinese civilians were killed. The one thing United States and China share in common is that they should work together to strengthen Islamic societies and modernize them and help them develop, so you get rid of all the terrorist problems that we've been having for a long time. So instead of China and America opposing each other, they should be working together in this area. Again, it's a very complex subject, but I do explain that in my book.
Thank you, Kishore. And just to underline this, and because it's such an important topic to all of us here, what is, as like a longtime diplomat, academic, and an expert, like when it comes to state sovereignty versus human rights, I mean, is your response like, if negative things are happening in terms of human rights, and obviously China is not the only country, there's human rights issues everywhere, but when it comes to East versus West, US versus China, what is the correct response from the West if there's human rights abuses happening, in your opinion, to both get to that positive outcome that you want in terms of collaboration, while also standing up for things that define Western society, at least as an ideal?
Well, I must tell you that, you know, one of China's best intellectuals, public intellectuals, I won't mention his name because it was a private conversation, told me this in private. He said, Kishore, for many years, when the United States lectured China on human rights, we Chinese, of course, publicly rejected those criticisms. But in our heart of hearts, he said, yes, the Americans are right. Their human rights standards are higher, our human rights standards are lower, and we must try to improve. So they accepted, even though they couldn't accept the criticism publicly, they accepted it privately and said, we must try to improve. But he said to me, Kishore, everything changed after Guantanamo. When Guantanamo happened, and when American soldiers were seen torturing prisoners, the Chinese said, okay, from now on, we will not accept any lectures from the United States, because the United States beats up people, we beat up people. There's no difference between us anymore. And I'm telling you this story because this is from one of China's most thoughtful intellectuals who used to look up to the United States a great deal. So I would say, if you want to change the human rights, and I think we should try to improve human rights of societies, because I always say, I don't want to have my fingernails pulled, okay? I don't want to live in a society which pulls my fingernails out. I want to live in a society with greater respect for human rights. But to achieve that, there are ways and means of doing it effectively, quietly. And I think I can tell you one positive thing, okay? In many Asian societies, in the time when I grew up, there were many violations of human rights. I give you an example. Indonesia, the world's largest Islamic country, okay? Over 260 million people. It was known as a society that used to violate human rights when it was run by President Suharto. Guess what? Today, Indonesia has become the world's most successful Islamic democracy. How did that happen? How did that happen, right? So I say, study the success stories. And it wasn't all about beating up Indonesia. It was actually all about working with Indonesia. And I can tell you one reason why it happened is because one of the Indonesian presidents under President Suharto went to study in the United States of America. And in the United States Military Academy, he learned about human rights. See, that's how you do it. Don't lecture, don't hector, but invite them and say, come and see what we are doing. And then they learn from that.
Thank you, Kishore, for answering this question gracefully. You know, it's a very uncomfortable topic, and I hope we all do better. And I appreciate you being willing to engage with it. We have a whole bunch of other questions, so I'm going to ask you these. Let's try to do 1 minute to the extent possible, even though they all deserve a lot more time. Very quickly, we already kind of related to this last point. Yusuf Fakr asked about how do you think the West will respond to a country like Lebanon, which risks becoming a failed state? And then also Nesreen Jabali asked, how do you see the US-China roles in the Middle East changing, given the reduced importance of oil in the world as we move to renewables? Specifically to Lebanon, and this is just my addition, there is like a choice that many are seeing the country facing, whether to go with IMF funding or a Chinese bailout. Share with us your thoughts on like this kind of like the spheres of influence between the West and the East as it relates to the Middle East.
Let me give you snappy answers. Now, there was another country much closer to China called Pakistan, which also got into economic troubles. And everyone thought that China would write a big check for Pakistan and say, don't worry, I'll take care of you. You know what China did? China told Pakistan, please go to the IMF. Please negotiate a good deal and we will support it and we will supplement it. So the Chinese actually in many ways would like to find a solution that is long-term and viable. And the Chinese know that they cannot save Lebanon. But if Lebanon goes to the IMF and gets a deal, China will support and enhance that deal, and it's in China's interest. So China actually wants to work with the West in, for example, taking care of the Middle East, all the problems down there. It's better for the IMF, World Bank, and United States, and Europe, and China working together to help these countries. And I can assure you that China is ready to do so.
Thank you so much, Kishore. Next one is from Hugo Nailey. If China does emerge as the world's leading economy, how do you expect China to reshape the world order?
Well, I think the Chinese are actually very happy with the 1945 rules-based order that was a gift from the United States and Europe to the world. So the Chinese will not try to fundamentally restructure the world. And if any of you have time, please read the speech given by President Xi Jinping in Davos in January 2017. And I was there in the room when he gave the speech. It's actually a very thoughtful speech in which he explains that the reason why China has become so successful is because China has actually integrated itself into the 1945 rules-based order. So China wants to keep the World Trade Organization, China wants to keep the World Health Organization, China wants to keep the United Nations, and China also wants to keep the World Bank and IMF. It's not trying to destroy them at all. So China is actually, because, you know, don't forget, the biggest beneficiary of the 1945 rules-based order today is China. So why should China destroy a system that has benefited China so much?
Thank you, Kishore. Next one is, the attendee asks, how do you see the long-term prospects for open democracy in China? Are there any cultural barriers that supports this, unique to Chinese culture or Confucian philosophy?
Well, I think in the long run, I believe that China will evolve towards becoming a democracy. But I emphasize long run because, you know, the Chinese learned a huge lesson from the effort made by the Russians to switch overnight from the Soviet Communist Party to becoming a democracy. And we saw the impact on Russia was so disastrous. You know, the Russian economy came down, Russian life expectancy came down, infant mortality went up, the poverty soared in Russia. So the Chinese look at all that and say, oh my God, that's what happens when you become a democracy overnight. Okay, let's make sure that we do it much more slowly. So, but don't forget that also at the end of the day, the Chinese have developed a political system which has to pay attention to the needs of its people. And even when they had emperors, they also said that the empress had to have what they call the mandate of heaven. And if the people rose up in revolution, the people would say, okay, the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven, time for him to go, right? So the Chinese have developed their own political culture and system. So I think at the end of the day, the best way to promote democracy in China is for the United States to show that when you have a democracy, you represent the most competent country in the world. But after COVID-19, I'm very sad to say this, the United States has had one of the most incompetent responses to COVID-19. And that unfortunately makes the Chinese feel, oh my God, what kind of system is this that has led to so many people dying in the United States of America? If the United States of America had the same rate of deaths as China, instead of having over 150,000 deaths, the United States would have less than 1,000 deaths. So therefore, at the end of the day, performance matters when it comes to marketing democracy.
Thank you, Kishore. Last audience question here from Glenn Yuan. He asks, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Kishore, on the reserve currency. Will China want to shift it? If so, how could the digital yuan play a role? And then there's a whole bunch of comments about the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you have any comments on your views on what role that plays and how it could lead to conflict versus collaboration in the future.
Well, on the Belt and Road Initiative, I would say don't bet against it. It will succeed. Because the Chinese, they may not succeed in 5 years, they may not succeed in 10 years, but what's the hurry? 30 years, 40 years, compared to 4,000 years, what's 30 to 40 years? Nothing. So Belt and Road Initiative is, over 30 to 40 years, they'll succeed. And then when it comes to the US dollar, I think China was actually very happy to see the US dollar remain as the global reserve currency, because while the US dollar was the global reserve currency, China went from having a GNP that in PPP terms was 10% of the United States to becoming bigger than the United States with the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So the US dollar facilitated China's rise. But now that the Trump administration is trying to weaponize the US dollar and use it against China, then China is looking for alternatives. And in my book, I describe how if the Chinese try to create a kind, not a currency, a digital unit of value to facilitate, let's say, trade between China and Argentina. Right now, when China buys beef from Argentina, it sends US dollars. When Argentina buys clothes from China, it sells US dollars. Why don't they just create an alternative unit of measurement based on blockchain technology? It technically can be done. And if it is done, then the role of the US dollar declines. And as I said earlier, if the US dollar is no longer the global reserve currency, the standard of living of the American people will go down. Therefore, it is not in the interests of the United States to weaponize the US dollar.
Thank you, Kishore, and thank you everybody who asked such great questions. We are at time's up. It's midnight in Singapore, and I want to ask you, Kishore, just last question to help us wrap up. You've been so generous with your time and insights. How can our community best support you and the endeavors and causes you care most about? And if you have a final word of wisdom or a call to action for all of us, we can end with that.
Well, I would say don't be frightened of China, because I know that one something I have not mentioned is that the reason why there's been a lot of negative Western reaction to China is because for the last few centuries, there's been buried in the Western psyche a fear of the yellow peril. It's real. So please get rid of that subconscious fears of the yellow peril and recognize that Chinese civilization is as good, as robust as Western civilization. And we will be far better off. You mentioned Lawrence Summers endorsing me. Lawrence Summers and I co-authored an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs where we said that instead of a clash of civilizations in the 21st century, we will see a fusion of civilizations where the best of East and the best of West can come about, can fuse and work together. So I want to end with a very optimistic note saying, you began with the East and West going apart. I can assure you that East and West can come together and live happily ever after.
Thank you, Kishore. Well, here's raising a virtual toast to the fusion of civilizations, as you said. Really appreciate you sharing all your thoughts and insights, getting us out of our comfort zones and getting us to think deeper. So I greatly appreciate it. Wish you the very best, and can't wait to meet you in person soon.
Okay, goodbye. Namaste.
Goodbye. Namaste. Take care, Kishore. Thank you, everybody. See you all again very soon.